Alright guys, welcome back. We are working our way through our nationalism and unification unit. We've covered so far what nationalism is. We've also covered the unifications of Italy and then Germany, and then talk about Germany's strength. And today we're going to go back to the topic of nationalism again, and we're going to look at how it weakened two empires in Europe. One's called the Austrian Empire, the other's called the Ottoman Empire. So let's get into it and figure out what's going on with nationalism. So as we've learned, nationalism can definitely unify people together, right? Unified the Italians around Italy, Germans around Germany, and so forth. But it turns out nationalism can do the opposite as well. It can divide people. And this is usually the case when you have, instead of one group of people, you have multiple groups of people who all identify something different, but they're all kind of contained within one country. That's going to lead to division within that country. So let's start with the Austrian Empire, see how nationalism plays a role in weakening that empire. So let's get kind of a lay of the land, figure out where Austria actually is. Everything you see here in color, guys, was part of one empire called the Austrian Empire. Okay, so all these different pieces was all one big empire, and Austria is kind of the core. That's why it's called the Austrian Empire. Now, it turns out that not everybody in this empire was the same. Okay, Austrians speak German. Okay, they're identified as ethnically German. So they're not that much different from the Germans over here in the German states. They just happen to live over here, and they control all these other people within the empire. So you've got a bunch of other groups you can see here by different names. All these are different nationalities who are being ruled over by the German Austrians. Now, of course, that leads us to, well, what's going to threaten to tear this empire apart? And that's, of course, nationalism, because all those other little groups, whether they're Polish or Hungarian or Slovakian or whatever, they don't feel represented in this empire. And as nationalism grew across Europe and inside Austria, what's happening is that the Austrian government is kind of responding the opposite direction. They're becoming more conservative, more repressive, more controlling, because what they fear that if they give in at all and show any weakness at all, what's going to happen is the empire will unravel. So they have to be very tough. And that's what you see in the cartoon here. All these different groups, they're kind of being muzzled. They're not allowed to speak freely. Only the Austrians have the authority here and the rights to say what they want. Every other group is just basically supposed to be quiet and follow the orders. Now, we learned a couple of lessons ago about this thing called the revolutions of 1848. They were motivated by nationalism in many countries. They spread all across Europe. And we learned that in the Austrian Empire, we had people like Hungarians and Italians rising up. And ultimately, those revolutions failed, but what they didn't fail in doing is ending the danger of nationalism to the empire. In fact, nationalism continued to grow. And so by the time we reach 1867, the pressure is so great that the Austrian authorities kind of come to the conclusion that if they don't give in, the empire is going to break up in a violent manner. And so under the pressure of Hungarian nationalists, and Hungarians made up basically the second biggest group in the empire after Austrian Germans, after pressure from the Hungarians, the Austrian authorities agree to basically divide the empire into two separate entities that will be co-ruled by one emperor. And so this is known as the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary. Sometimes it's also referred to as the Austro-Hungarian Empire or the Empire of Austria-Hungary. It's got different kind of names, but basically the point is this is a reaction to the growing intensity of nationalism that Austria has to cave in and give this group more autonomy or self-rule within the empire. The reality is, though, that while Hungarians, the purple group here, they got more self-rule, what about all the other groups? What about your Czechs? What about your Poles, your Ukrainians, your Italians, Romanians, and so forth? Well, they didn't get that. And so nationalism continues to grow within the empire, particularly among Slavic people. In Slavs, you can see all the little subgroups within this larger group of Slavs. Russians would also be included in the group of Slavs. Russians are kind of like the big brother in the Slavic family, basically. And again, nationalism is growing and growing and growing, which means that Austria is a country that on paper looks strong because it's really big, but in fact it's very weak. All right, our second empire is the Austrian Empire, and they're going through a lot of the same things Austria was going through at the same time. So, in fact, let's look at the composition of people living in the Austrian Empire, or excuse me, the Ottoman Empire by 1914, the year World War I begins. And you're going to notice that the biggest group would be the ethnic Turks. This is why when we think of the Ottoman Empire, we think of Turkey, because that's the core. Okay, this is where the Ottoman Empire began, with Turkish people right through here, and then they spread their empire across southeastern Europe, the Middle East, North Africa, all over the place. It's one of the great empires in all of history, and it's a very long-lasting empire at that. But like the Austrian Empire up here, you've got lots of different groups who don't feel totally represented, and they feel controlled by an outside group, the Turks. In fact, nationalism is so weakening this empire that people began referring to it as the sick man of Europe. In other words, the Ottoman Empire is seen as basically terminally ill, that it's going to die, it's just a question of when, not if. And because it's in this dying state, other empires and nations around it can look to take advantage, maybe take territory away from the Ottoman Empire. And of course, rebels within the empire also see an opportunity to rebel and perhaps gain independence. Now, the focal point of a lot of this instability because of nationalism comes from a place called the Balkans. And if you've never heard of the term the Balkans, that's okay, but it basically refers to southeastern Europe. Think about basically the land east of Italy, so places like Greece and Serbia, which we have actually talked about earlier in this unit, but other places like Bulgaria and Romania and modern-day Bosnia and so forth. This is the area that was intensely unstable because of nationalism, and the reason is you have a bunch of different ethnic groups all living, side by side, and they don't want to be ruled by the Ottomans any longer. And so that's the impression we get from this political cartoon, where we've got trouble boiling up in the Balkans, and the European leaders, they're trying to keep a lid on it because they fear that a war that breaks out in the Balkans could spread beyond the Balkans. And this area is so unstable that it's called the powder keg of Europe. And that's a reference to an actual powder keg, in other words, a keg of gunpowder that clearly, with a little spark, could just explode dramatically. And that's what people fear, that a little spark down here somewhere could blow up this area, then it could spread across Europe. And in fact, that's exactly what's going to happen in 1914. So when we get to World War I and we talk about the assassination of the Archduke of Austria, Franz Ferdinand, in Serbia, by a Serbian nationalist, that is the spark that's going to set off a gigantic explosion of war across Europe and the world. So that was our look at Austria and the Ottoman Empire. Those two empires weakened by nationalism and the fear of division and rebellion because of those feelings. All right, in our next video, guys, we're going to stay in the same location. We're going to look at Eastern Europe, but we're going to go to a different country and see what's going on with nationalism there.